You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
And it has sure been a day, hasn't it, folks? Welcome. Happy Wednesday. This is Scotty Roberts. This is the Intrepid radio program. And let's get going over here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com for all of you who want to go check out all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. And you can also come over to my YouTube channel, watch the simulcast video stream to this show over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Join the other Intrepids, excuse me, in the chat room, and let's see where everything goes tonight. Have a good time over here. So, here we are in the middle of, not even the middle, I don't know if we're anywhere near the end. I don't see the end. So, we're going to stop calling this a series that I'm pursuing. It started that way, but there's so many other subtopics within it. We're just going to go topic after topic after topic until I feel we've really gotten to the point where we have covered this whole why do you believe what you believe thing. And so ask yourself and keep asking yourself, why do I believe what I believe? Today we're going to go into the roots in Israel of what ended up coming up in the Jesus movement in the first few centuries. And that is this whole concept of one God, the concept of monotheism, as opposed to all the great mystery teachings, the pagan mysteries, the Gnostic mysteries that are out there. And so let's take a look at this. I want to just launch right into material without a lot of fanfare because there's a lot of stuff here tonight. And we're going to talk about the Yahweh-Alone movement. Yahweh, of course, being that word in Hebrew, which translates as Jehovah. And remember where that came from? 1,500 years earlier than the establishment of the State of Israel, you had the Mesopotamian culture, the Sumer-Akkad culture, the Sumerians, and they had their god caste, the Anunnaki. And the chief god was Enlil, also known as Elil. And you had a brother god, Enki, Ea. And these gods, through over the next 1,000 to 1,500 years, as people migrated from the Euphrates River Valley, Euphrates and Tigris, actually, and they came down south into the Canaanite region, Elil of the chief gods, one of the chief god of the Anunnaki, became known as El, just simply El for God, Elil to El. And El, of course, became Elohim, El Shaddai, El Elyon, names for God in the Old Testament. But then also Enki, Ea, came down into the Canaanite, Canaanite cultures, and Ea became the base word for the Hebrew Yahweh, which is Jehovah. So these were two totally separate gods. Elohim, 3,000 times in the Old Testament. Elohim was the creator of the universe, the creator of the world, the creator of all that was. The God of harsh judgment, all through the early Old Testament. And Yahweh, Jehovah, became the Savior God, the more compassionate side of God. And we somehow melded them, or they melded them into the two into one. And while they were two separate characters. But there's this Yahweh-Alone movement. And it's a fact that at one time, scholars believed that Judaic monotheism, most biblical started in the time of Abraham. And most scholars now agree that it probably started much later. So the time of Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation, Abraham and his son Isaac, then his son Jacob, who was also known as Israel. And so most biblical scholars now agree that it occurred later than the time of Abraham. But monotheism most likely, this belief that there is a singular one God, arose in about the 9th century BCE as a very minority movement. and it grew until it became a standard in the 6th century. Now, what was going on in the 9th century? This is just post-David Solomon, is the 9th century. And the story of monotheism in Judaism is presented by many scholars. Then it's the story of the emergence, the eventual success of what is termed the Yahweh-Alone movement. And according to Lang, one of the scholars we've talked about before, this was a movement of priests and scribes who not only promoted the worship of Israel's national God, Yahweh, but prescribed that Yahweh was the only God who could be worshipped. Now, mainstream Old Testament scholars currently accept the events described in the Old Testament as actual historical events, historical occurrences, things that really happened, that took place on the dates given for them, just as the mainstream. And if you remember our series on King David, most of what I talk about with King David was chronologically and historically intact information until you got into the apologetic, you got into the theology. And it was David who actually established the cult of Yahweh worship in Jerusalem. There was no temple there at first, and he wanted to build a temple. It was his son, Solomon, who built the temple, but he brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem from Bethel. And so that is how this worship started in the 10th century, and then, of course, trickling down into the 9th century. And so the New Testament scholars believe Jesus was a historical person, and the events told about him actually occurred, just like these Old Testament scholars speaking of the Old Testament occurrences. And Old Testament scholars generally date the writings of the Old Testament to the period of the events being described. So, as an example, the Old Testament describes events occurring in the 8th century BCE. Conventional scholarship accepts that the event occurred, that it occurred in the 8th century, and that the writing of it was created shortly thereafter. Other scholars who are more skeptical and don't assume that the Old Testament is actually historical, according to these scholars, the Old Testament is a collection of stories or oral traditions that were assigned dates and a chronological order that was later, and they use a variety of reasons to do this. Some scholars accept biblical dates for some events while dismissing dates for other events that have been proven to be non-historical, often based on archaeological findings or the lack thereof. Now, the problem with this is that a lot of things that they once thought were not archaeologically sustainable have had discoveries over the recent decades that have really turned all of that on its ear, finding that the chronology of the Old Testament is basically historical. The events are basically historical. Whether or not the miracles contained within them, the acts of God, the theology, and so on, is provable or not. In most cases, is not. And so I happen to be an historical purist when it comes to the Old Testament. I believe that the Old Testament is chronological. I believe, or it has its chronology. I believe that it's historical. And so, and a lot of the events there are historical. Now, take, for instance, the place where I stand, the Exodus, I believe, was an historical event. I believe it took place in the mid-1400s BCE. I believe you can plug in the names of the pharaohs that fit the date accordingly. Now, that's what I believe about it, is that Moses, a man, led people out of Egypt. He either led a rebellion, however that was actually pictured. Now, the faith story alongside that is that Yahweh sent him to deliver these people, that Yahweh brought plagues, that Yahweh parted the Red Sea, and all these miracles. Now, who knows what those are? I do know that there are actual historical events that occurred that coincide with some of these miracles. So the big question you have to ask, was it a miraculous event of the divine? Was Moses an opportunist and used actual natural occurrences to bolster his case that God was on his side. So we don't know exactly what happened with those, but we do have a lot of evidence starting to simmer to the top that shows that these events took place, the actual base core occurrence. So if the first group of scholars were asked how they know, for example, that King Josiah lived between 641 and 609 BC, and that he said certain things, they would answer, because the Old Testament says he does. And other scholars aren't content with this answer. They want to know if archaeology and other literature of the period supports this fact. Same with the Moses story, same with all of this. Some scholars approach the Old Testament as a collection of literature, subject to the same concerns as other literary creations, even where the Old Testament mentions historical personages known from other sources to have existed, such as Ahab and Jehu. They still urge caution. There's a Professor Philip Davies, for example, who's a biblical scholar in the non-historical camp. He observes that while Shakespeare wrote about Julius Caesar, we do not assume that Caesar actually did and said the things Shakespeare attributes to him. Now that, of course, if you look at that, is starting from the beginning to be an act of fiction. When Shakespeare wrote his play Julius Caesar, he was not writing a history. He was writing a play to put on the stage, to charge people a penny to come in and watch and make money to support his theater. That's very different from what the Old Testament writers were doing. Now, we understand that Shakespeare's play is this literary construct, and there are no literary criteria for believing David to be more historical than, say, Joshua. Joshua more historical than Abraham, and Abraham more historical than Adam. An additional problem, in fact, is that there is no non-literary way of making this judgment call in either direction, since none of these characters left much of a trace outside the biblical text. I think something you can attribute this to, as we talked about, say, King David in that long series. I did 17 episodes on King David and the apologetics of King David. King David, the real-life story of an invented hero, is what we called that series. You go start looking through that, listening to those again, or digging into David, and you're going to find that there wasn't a whole lot about David that existed archaeologically. But you also find that he is more than likely was a tribal chieftain who made himself the king over all the little tribes. Remember the little cities we mentioned that were dotted all over the north of Israel and Judea? Judah. He took all of these and unified them. He forced a unification and became the great high king, so to speak. And then Solomon took over, and shortly after Solomon, I think it was his son, Jeroboam, Rehoboam, these two kings, they eventually divided the kingdom again into north and south. So David's kingdom was very short-lived, but he was a warrior chieftain who ended up unifying all these little clans and cities and tribes in the hills in order to fight. And the purpose of the king was to fight and defend the territory. And he could draw armies from all these little city-states, if you will. Well, David unified all that, no matter what you believe about David. And, of course, that was all chalked up to, well, there's not a lot of archaeological evidence. It's probably because it was not a big, grand, and glorious kingdom like Egypt. It was a tribal kingdom. But now, in recent years, they're finding all sorts of artifacts in archaeology that sustain. There was an administration of David, the house of David inscriptions. All of these things are starting to come to surface. And so archaeology is beginning to back up the factual, literal story that is beneath the fanciful story, the apologetic, or the fictional tale that sometimes it's laid over the top. Something to make the king look good, to make him look better. In a conversation I had the other day, this just popped into my head. I was talking about something we talked about in that David series. Remember, what do we know about David? According to the Old Testament, he was the young man who came in and slew the great giant Goliath, who was the big warrior for the Philistine army. And King Saul granted then David all kinds of favors as a result of this. Well, all we've known all the way along is King David, David and Goliath, all the way up into modern terminology. David and Goliath is something that we use as a label to talk about the underdog defeating the greater power. It was even in, wasn't it in Caddyshack? He's lining up, he's going to take the shot. It's a David and Goliath story. It's everywhere. We know about David and Goliath. Now, here's the interesting thing. That was a story attributed to David. I believe that was in the apologetic of David. You've got to consider some of the other writings, even within the Bible. In another book in the Bible, which chronicles the kings, isn't specifically the story of David that was probably ordered by David, the apologetic on his own life in the books of Samuel. In the book of Chronicles, you show there's a listing of all the mighty men who worked for David, all of his mighty warriors. And there was one passage where it's listing all the mighty deeds of his mighty men. Just one after. It's almost like a bullet-pointed list. And there's one place where it says, and Elhanan the Bethlehemite slew Goliath, whose spear shaft was like a weaver's rod. And then it moves on into the next guy. Now, if you go back to the story of David and Goliath, Goliath was a giant, 6 cubits in a span. David slew him, but the guy had a spear that was like a weaver's rod, a huge shaft on his spear. And so the big question comes up, did David create an apologetic? Did he take on the act of one of his mighty men, attribute that to himself in the apologetic to make himself look better? Or did Elhanan, the Bethlehemite, take that on himself? Problem is, Elhanan didn't write that passage where he's just in a list of things that were done. So who would it merit most or profit most to acquire the story for themselves? Why, the rising king of Israel, and that would be David. And so he acquired that deed onto himself. And while Elhanan is mentioned in another book as having done that. Now, if you look at the English version of that verse, it says Elhanan slew Goliath, whose spear shaft so-and-so. Well, they put in parentheses, or not in parentheses, in italics, Goliath, the brother of Goliath. It says brother of Goliath. And the italics are there in the English to show where words were added for clarity that aren't really there in the Hebrew translation. So the actual Hebrew says, Elhanan the Bethlehemite slew Goliath. While in the English it says, Elhanan the Bethlehemite slew the brother of Goliath. So there you go. And you have to make your determination there. There's no archaeological evidence for any of those. But I also need to say here as well that the Bible itself can stand as an historical document. It might be a religious document, but there aren't a whole lot of ancient documents that exist out there that did not also reflect the religions or the gods or the doings of the gods for that particular people group. This is what you go even into Henry VIII, Elizabeth, his daughter, the first of England, and you start looking at legal documentations of legislation and edicts of the king, and they were all, or the queen, and they were all wrapped around what they believed about Protestantism or Catholicism and so on. So that existed. Now, with this background, through the development of monotheism in the Old Testament, we present findings of all different kinds of scholars out there, from both the historical and the non-historical perspectives, just as I have in the past in this presentation. And the document sources here are very carefully listed so that we can study the arguments for ourselves. Make your own decisions about them. So I'm going to go into a list of things here that I have in my notes. So the beginning of the Yahweh-Alone movement was roughly 841 to 722 BC. Or that's backwards, 722 down to 841 to 722. Many scholars say that the story of Yahweh-Only Movement begins in the 9th century BCE. And according to the Old Testament, after King Solomon died, his kingdom split into two pieces, the north and the south. There's Philip Davies, who's a biblical historian of the non-historical school, cautions readers to remember that there is no archaeological evidence that the empires of either David or Solomon existed. Now, that's an old quote, because in recent years even, just last year I believe it was, they discovered coins, the minted coins, in a small town in Israel, one of these small cities, dotting the hillsides, that had the mark of being from the administration of David. And so we always have to approach this stuff with caution, because there's no archaeological evidence. Now we can just say there's not a vast amount of archaeological evidence. But I can tell you what, if all you have is one coin that's been unearthed, dates to the period, and says it's a coin that's utilized by the administration of the House of David, what do you got there? You got something. You got archaeological evidence. And then it expands from there. Everything else starts to come into play. There's an inscription on a stone found at Tel Dan in the region of Galilee that's dated to the 9th century BCE, which mentions the House of David. And this has become controversial. Why is it controversial? Because it goes against the accepted non-historical academics surrounding David. So that's the only reason something becomes controversial, is because it goes against something. And although otherwise there's agreement that there's no archaeological evidence that either the reigns of David or Solomon existed historically. But now you got this inscription. The conditions were such in the 10th century that they could have supported a kingdom such as Solomon's. After Solomon's kingdom divided into two pieces, the northern territory was called Israel and the southern was called Judah. And in the northern kingdom there arose for the first time a faction of priests who urged the worship of Yahweh alone. That's what we're getting at here. And so, if there was this faction of priests, and we know there was a Yahweh alone movement, and it happened in the northern kingdom after the kingdom split back again. So remember, they were all divided before the time of David and Solomon. Now they're split again. That kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of what was going on historically over there. Now we got 3 minutes left in this first half, so maybe 2 minutes. So let's see what we can get through. The first Old Testament stories of the Yahweh alone movement appear to occur in the 9th century in the northern kingdom, when the prophet Elijah rose up and incited a mob to riot and murder the priests of Baal. In approximately the same time in the southern kingdom, the Old Testament recounts that King Asa, who died in 875 BC, and his son Jehoshaphat, the first king to have a name compounded with Yahweh, Jehoshaphat, briefly promoted the worship of Yahweh alone. And there's no prohibition to worship other gods that can be found in the Old Testament before the 9th century BCE. And that prohibitions like that seem to be dated much earlier, were edited into the Old Testament writings later. That's the contention. And so examples are the editing this are all over in the book of Exodus, Genesis, Judges, 1 Samuel, 1 Kings, and Numbers. And those are things we'll talk about along the way here. And so right now we are coming up, we're close to the end of this first half of the show. I want to watch the clock because I ran a little over yesterday. But in the following generation after this, King Jehoram, 852 to 834, of the northern kingdom, restricts Baal worship, and King Jehu is credited with eliminating it. However, Lang, the historian, cautions that these reforms were political, not religious, not spiritual. and that the Bible record indicates that Jehoram and Jehu were not monotheists, and they did not worship Yahweh exclusively. And so there's this gap in the Old Testament writings with no more Yahweh alone stories appearing until the next century in the book of Hosea, who was a prophet active in the northern kingdom. And so we got to kind of cut it off there for this first half. You sit tight for 2 minutes. We're going to come back, and we're going to look at this a little more, how this monotheism became established and then worked its way into Christianity later. Hang on. We'll be right back. All right, folks, we're back. Thanks for sitting through the break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network, ODYSY1.com. And you can come over and watch the simulcast in video on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Join the other Intrepids in the chat room. Throw in your ideas, your opinions. Talk about this, talk about that. I don't care. Come on over. I don't care what you talk about is what I mean over there. Come on over and watch the show and join the live chat room. Now I'm going to jump right back into this because I left off at a crucial point in the information. Now, what we're doing here, I have been talking about, as you know, as you've been listening to this show for the last 3 weeks on this particular thread that we're on, I'm looking at how Christianity and paganism are compatible, how they are incompatible. Looking at the ancient early church in the first couple of centuries, what they believed compared to what orthodoxy became. Looking at what paganism believes. And in really trying to decipher early Christianity, we're digging back now into the Old Testament, from which Christianity sprouts, and we are looking at the history of monotheism versus polytheism, which really establishes for you what you get when you come to the time of Jesus and the formulation of the early church. So there's a lot of history in here, but if you went to Sunday school, if you went to church, if you were Christian, hopefully this stuff will enlighten, turn on a little bit of light. I always said I love history and the look at it because it illuminates. It's like opening the door to a dark room and illuminating things a little better. If you weren't Christian and you just wanna get this information, this will tell you how Christianity came about, how it is what it is today, why Judaism is what it is today compared to paganism. So let's just dig back into this. We were talking about there was this gap in the Old Testament writings with no more Yahweh alone stories appearing until that 8th century in the book of Hosea. He was a prophet who was active in the northern kingdom. Most of the knowledge of this era comes from the book of Hosea, this era in Israel, as no independent historical sources for it have been found anywhere. And so it's in Hosea that the reader finds the first statement that worship of Yahweh alone is required, as in Hosea 13:4, which states, "Yet I am the Lord your God from the land of Egypt, and you shall know no God but me, for there is no Savior besides me." End quote. And while this might sound like language borrowed from the Ten Commandments, the sequence is actually a bit reversed. There's a majority of biblical scholars who believe the story of Moses and the Ten Commandments were written much later than Hosea. And frankly, they were. But they were rewritten, I believe. The events took place in the mid-1400s to 1400. Let me clarify what I'm saying, because I'm not being clear. Remember, the dates are backwards in BC. They're counting down the way we look at them from this perspective now in the present. So 1446 down to 1400. And then a little bit after 1400 into the late 1300s is when Moses wrote this stuff. But remember, it was all restructured and rewritten in the late 500s, early 400s BCE at the Library of Alexandria by the 72 rabbis, which we talked about, who went there to reconstruct the destroyed Hebrew scriptures after the Babylonian captivity. So, we can say that none of this stuff existed. That's a fact. They didn't exist anymore. They were wiped out. They were written in the 4th and 5th centuries. But that's because it was a rewriting of oral tradition mixed with what they could find in storage at the Library of Alexandria. So this whole thing, Hosea notes that the exclusive worship of Yahweh wasn't the common practice of the day, because he's issuing commands from God for the people to, wait a minute, worship only me. And as we've already noted, too, the polytheistic practices continued well into the 6th century BC, another 200 years. During the monarchic period, the Yahweh-Only Movement was comprised of a very small number of independent groups from differing social backgrounds. One such group was found in the royal court of the southern kingdom, another in the Jerusalem temple, another among the followers of the prophets, and a few among sects such as the Rechabites. And so Hosea refers to all gods other than Yahweh as the Baals, the Baalim, the plural form of Baal. And he rejects any cults that promote them. Yet, interestingly, one meaning of the word Baal is husband. Baal, B-A-A-L, Baal. And Hosea uses that meaning in the 2nd chapter of his book when he identifies Yahweh as the Baal, or the husband of the land and the people. And it becomes clear that Hosea believes Yahweh to be the husband of the people literally, and so equates the worship of other gods with adultery. And Yahweh loves his people, but they are unfaithful. Therefore Yahweh is filled with anger and metes out judgment and punishment. So says Hosea. The theme of adultery gives the writings of Hosea and later prophets this unusual power over the people that alternates between love and hatred, and it's full of sexual metaphor and violence. And the association of polytheism with adultery also created a really unfortunate identity between other views of divinity and being immortal. The association lingers to this very day, and it contributes to making discussions difficult between monotheists and polytheists, and those they suspect of not being monotheistic. And the adultery, quote-unquote, of polytheism provokes rage and jealousy in Yahweh, Jehovah. And these emotions are such a central theme in the prophetic literature that eventually jealousy becomes Yahweh's outstanding feature No longer is he the God of holiness, the God of love, the God of other things, other attributes. He is the God of jealousy. And the imitation and execution of this jealousy are identified as peculiar virtues of Yahweh's followers and were without parallel in the Near East. So what you see now, say, in radicalized, terroristic Islamic cults on top of Islam, is that they are out there trying to destroy anybody who does not believe what they believe. That's an extreme example. You see this down through the ages with mostly the Abrahamic religions, who would go out and try to wipe out those who believed differently than they believed. And I would think that if God, according to the New Testament, wants to win the hearts and the minds of everyone, that he loved everyone, forgave everyone, offers salvation to everyone, the best way to accomplish that is not to go out and cut their heads off if they disbelieve what you're telling them. How do you win over somebody who is not a believer in what you believe? Through your life, through your lifestyle. And then you've got to provide your facts and so on. Evangelicalism, promotion of your religion, what's the word I'm looking for? Proselytizing. That all takes place because you have something to share and something good to give to somebody. Not going out and killing those who didn't believe the way you believed. Now, it's not as clear what effects the Yahweh-Alone movement had in the southern kingdom of Israel, Judah. The Old Testament literature is pretty silent on this point until the story of the reforms of King Hezekiah. And he lived from 739 to 699 BCE. His reforms were very modest and consisted of cutting down one Asherah sacred tree, Asherah the goddess, and destroying Moses' bronze serpent. Remember the bronze serpent story during the Exodus? That had taken place at this point, maybe 700 to 800 years earlier. They still had the bronze serpent on the pole in the temple. And he cut down the Asherah tree, Hezekiah did, and he destroyed Moses' bronze serpent because people were starting to worship it or had been worshiping it. Big question is, what was Moses doing at that time? What were the people doing at that time? If they had to look to the serpent to be healed, they worshiped that serpent. Now, the end of this period brings us to 722 BC, at which time the historical records note that the house of Omri fell to Assyrian control. Now, according to the Old Testament, the southern kingdom of Judah continued on for more than another 100 years until it fell to the Babylonians in 586 BCE. Now, the existence of a southern kingdom called Judah in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE is entirely theoretical, so says Davies, one of these historians. However, he notes that beginning in the 700s, the Assyrians created a small state in that region called Yehud and made Jerusalem its administrative center. After the Assyrians took Omri in 722 BCE, it's possible that some of its residents fled south into Yehud, and I think that's a bunch of historical bullshit. That is the way some of these scholars tried to get around the fact that there is scant evidence that Israel and Judah existed as the Bible says. Sometimes I find that there are historians out there that claim to be biblical scholars that really their only purpose is to try to disprove what the Bible says. That's okay. If that's your thing, go ahead and go about it. But I think a lot of these guys have to ignore a lot of data or work their way. You know what? Look at the impeachment process that's going on right now. You get a good picture of who believes what and what they ignore or have to accept or have to try to manipulate to mean something different than it does in order to reach their goals. And you get the idea of what some of these biblical scholars do. Now, King Josiah, 641 to 609 BCE, the Old Testament writings fall silent again until the story of King Josiah. And in the year 622, a scroll is brought to the king, who was about 20 years old at the time. remember, which wasn't as much of a kid then as it is now, and by the high priest of Jerusalem, who was named Hilkiah, and Hilkiah told the king Josiah that the scroll was discovered during the restoration of the temple. And this scroll, which would become chapters 12 through 26 of the book of Deuteronomy, contained a code of law that no one had ever seen before, and that overthrew previous ritual practice. So, supposedly, the writings of Moses, the law, as we find them in chapters 12 through 26 of Deuteronomy, was rediscovered on this scroll. And it hadn't been in practice. And so the scroll commanded that only Yahweh be worshipped. It imposed a duty of pilgrimage to Jerusalem, consolidated power in the priesthood at Jerusalem, and ordered all shrines outside of Jerusalem to be closed. Now, mind you, when Moses wrote the original Deuteronomy, they weren't in the land, so this wasn't about Jerusalem. Jerusalem worship, how to a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. All of this all started after the time of David, which was 700-800 years later than the time of Moses, the time when Moses was supposed to have written the original book of Deuteronomy. And this was all in the rewrites. It came more in the rewrites, but this is something they attribute to that, and yet it's full of commands that had nothing to do with what the Israelites would have been experiencing as a nomadic people, without a nation, without a capital city, and so on. And so this scroll also said that Jerusalem, the priesthood at Jerusalem ordered all the shrines outside of Jerusalem to be closed. It advocated the destruction of neo-Orthodox shrines and worshippers. King Josiah instituted the reforms contained in this scroll and agreed to rule from it. And the Old Testament recounts that he destroyed temples outside of Jerusalem and put non-Orthodox priests to death, the edge of the sword, as it says. Look at 2 Chronicles 34 and 2 Kings 23 to get this information. However, Josiah's reforms were short-lived, lasting only as long as his reign. As soon as he died in 609 BC, the story says that the people returned to their prior polytheistic and syncretist ways, and the Yahweh-Alone movement continued in a minority of the people. So Davies, the historian, uses this story as an example of what concerns him about conventional biblical scholarship. He notes that the only evidence for the story is the Bible itself. And that's an argument that I have. I remember I used this example once before, but I was once filming on a proposed television show that dealt with giants. And this was a few years ago, about 5 years ago. And we had to go to the red fields in Texas and work with some paleontologists. And we were filming, and one of our guys was a Christian, young earth, 6,000, 7,000 years old, believer in the Bible, but also a paleontologist. And he said, well, his excuse was that skeletons of dinosaurs, it all looks millions of years old because that's how God created it. And we were questioning, I was talking to him, and through some of this filming, I'm going, Joe, how do you believe that when you have scientific evidence in front of you versus writings in the Bible? Do you think that there's a way to mesh them a little better than that? And his answer was always, well, the Word of God says, or God said in this verse, or that. And I stopped him once and I said, Joe, you got to stop doing that. I said, you've got to step outside the box of faith and look back in and try to sustain that faith with outside evidence if you're going to make comments like these. You can't sustain faith from within the faith. Now, that sustains the faithful, and that's it. I said, you can't convince somebody outside the faith from within the faith that they're believing that there's something good to believe there. And that's that. And so this is what Davies was getting at with this Old Testament stuff. The only evidence for the stories were the Bible itself. So no historical or archaeological evidence has been found to support the existence of the reign of a King Josiah, or any of the other events that occur in that particular story, despite the fact that Josiah would have been king in or near the Assyrian province of Yehud, which I don't buy at all. I believe Yehud, or Judea, was the southern kingdom of Israel. So you have to ask if the story makes sense for this region in the age of the monarchy. Would a king adopt a book of rules which has been silent concerning the powers and responsibilities of the king? Would a king who's been on the throne since he was 8 years old happily and eagerly abdicate his authority by agreeing to the rule from a scroll that was discovered while redesigning the temple? And if Josiah had been willing to do so, it's very doubtful that his courtiers would have allowed it, as their livelihoods depended on the monarchy. So given all these considerations, the truth of this story is highly improbable. This is one of those apologetic type stories added for the believers, the faithful of Israel. The king existed, but did this event happen? We don't know. Maybe there was a turn to Jehovah-only worship at the time, but you can't credit Josiah with being the creator of Jewish monotheism, even though a lot of scholars want to. So now let's look at the fall of what kind of time do we have here? We got a few minutes left here. So let's look at the fall of Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile, which took place in 586 BC. So in or around 586, the Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar captured and destroyed the city of Jerusalem. The Jewish monarchy came to an end, and Yehud, or Judah, became a province subject to tribute. And some of the people fled to Egypt as refugees. Others were forcibly exiled to Babylon. That's when it said they carried off the children of Israel to Babylon. Now, it's noted by some of these historical scholars that the record tells little about the Babylonian exile. But it's known that deportation was a common practice in that period after a conquest. Deportation was used not only for control and punishment of the people that they just conquered, but also to move labor where it was needed throughout Mesopotamia. So when you hear about the children of Israel in the Bible being carried off to Babylon, it was probably in slavery. And there were some very famous people that arose out of that lot in Babylon. One of them was Daniel. Remember the story of Daniel in the lion's den. Another one was the three young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were thrown into the fiery furnace and were spared miraculously by God. So deportees were initially cut off from their religious artifacts and their documents, since the idea of deportation was to alienate people from their homeland. So beginning with the fall of Jerusalem, the hour of the Yahweh-Alonists had come. It was over. Members of this movement portray the fall of Israel in 722 BC and the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE as Yahweh's punishment for Israel maintaining their practice of polytheism. Now, Lang, the historian, notes that these Yahweh alone voices are now known as the Deuteronomic school among conventional scholars, and that they wrote the books of Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And these writings present a rather bulky history that goes back to the time of Moses and reinterprets events from their perspective. Smith calls this work a singular system. And it's a single system containing history, laws, customs, and prophecies that demand the worship of Yahweh. Demand the worship of Yahweh. And Yahweh alone. It's noted that the Deuteronomists also set out to make Israel a separate and unique people by banning intermarriage, promoting customs not followed by their neighbors, and requiring the teaching and the reciting of the law. There was a church musical I was in once that was really very good, and I played a member of the Sanhedrin, and he spoke in his song, and this just pops into my head because of the wording here. He talked about how there must be nothing greater than the temple, nothing firmer than the law. This was how he was raised. And this is how the Jewish rulers were raised. When you get down to the first century, there was nothing that was greater than the temple in Jerusalem. And there was nothing that was firmer than the law of God. These were the Deuteronomists. You could call them legalists even by a vernacular nowadays. So abstention from the work on the seventh day, the Sabbath, also became a mandatory thing in Jewish law, perhaps from the 6th century BC and on. Ezekiel's writings show no knowledge of a Sabbath, but a later editorial addition to Ezekiel adds a reference to it. Look at Ezekiel 46:1. And the idea of a Sabbath day was not new, as such a day was observed in many religions in the region. There's a historian, James Bonwick, who noted that even the ancient Egyptians consecrated the seventh day of the week to Amun-Ra, and that they observed this day by visiting the temples and praying. I always said that Moses, who came out of that Egyptian form of worship, included that in the law. And so no businesses were allowed to be conducted. You could only visit temples and pray and so on. It came down to, in Orthodox Judaism down through the ages now, that you didn't do anything on the Sabbath. You cooked your meals the day before. You basically sat, you meditated, you prayed. You didn't go outside the house. You didn't do this or that. Remember when Jesus was teaching, what were they doing exactly? Was he teaching or were they eating something? And the Sanhedrin approached him and said, "How can you be doing this on the Sabbath?" And Jesus said, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And he said, "Is it unlawful to pull your ox out of a ditch on the Sabbath? No. Is it unlawful to save a life on the Sabbath? No." So it was very interesting. These Deuteronomists existed all the way into the 1st century. Deuteronomists, and this is where we're getting the Yahweh-Onlyists. So the 5th tablet of the Babylon epic of creation it tells of the god Marduk, and that on the 7th day he appointed a holy day, and to cease from all work. He commanded that this was the command of Marduk. Hosea calls these days the days of Baalim. Look at Hosea 2:13 through 15. There was also a law that gave agricultural workers a day off in every 7th during plowing and harvesting seasons. And when the work was the heaviest, this was not a year-round observance, however, but it was seasonal. And Babylon had a similar rule, although it was year-round, giving its workers a day off every 10 days. And the Deuteronomist writers determinedly worked to rededicate the Sabbath concept, obviously of ancient origin, to the worship of Yahweh alone. And this filters down to what we find in the 1st century and the beginning of the Jesus movement. So, we got to end there. We're at the end of the show. There's so much more material here. So much stuff to discuss. I'm breaking this all down so you get a good, clear picture of what was going on. And I hope you're enjoying this as much as I'm enjoying delivering it. So, thanks for being here. I'm going to take a 23-hour break, and we'll be back tomorrow night. Sit tight.